Good day. I want to welcome everyone to today's Association for Learning Environments webinar, Makerspaces, from elementary schools to college campuses. Our speakers today are Gwen Morgan and Allison Schneider from Stantec. An interior designer with more than 10 years of experience, Gwen is Stantec's discipline leader for interior design and leader in the company's research and benchmarking group that recently examined makerspaces as a component of modern education. Allison is a senior interior designer who shapes user experiences through concept-driven design, space planning, sustainability, graphics, and material selection. She specializes in education design, particularly K through 12, and channels the curiosity of her inner child to design spaces to be fun, functional, and stimulating. So I'm now going to turn the presentation over to our speakers, and thank you so much for joining us for today's program.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, and special thanks to A4LE as well for organizing this series and helping to keep us all connected during this time. This course is registered with AIA, and I believe Matt will go over a little more detail at the end on that as far as certificates. As far as our learning objectives today, we are going to go over the origins of makerspaces. We're going to start to differentiate and categorize a few different types, which will help you in designing based on client and program needs, as well as highlight a handful of case studies supporting each of these categories. Finally, we will do a deep dive into one particular project and then forecast the future of makerspaces as they adapt to our changing culture. So my name is Allison Schneider. As Matt said, I'm a senior interior designer in Stantec's Austin, Texas office. Been in the education design field for about 10 years and am part of Stantec has several research and benchmarking groups. So one group that we're a part of focuses on interior environments, and we specifically took on the recent project of studying makerspaces in more depth, and that is what we want to share with you today. So I'll pass it over to Gwen.
Hello, everyone. This is Gwen Morgan. I'm a principal and interior designer at Stantec, and I'm also the discipline leader for our interior design at a firm-wide level. And I lead the research and benchmarking team for furniture in the interior environments that Ali spoke about. So we look forward to sharing with you today. So let's start first of all, by talking just a little bit about makerspaces and kind of where this started as a trend. As you guys know, makerspaces are not really a new idea. This picture you see on the screen is of Thomas Edison's lab at Menlo Park, New Jersey, which his father actually built. He had a number of other spaces adjacent to this lab, including a glass house, a carpenter shop, a carbon shed, a blacksmith shop. And this was really kind of one of the earliest examples in this country of a research and development facility. So it was here that Edison, worked on developing the telephone. He also experimented with the idea of recording the sound of human voice. And this was around 1876, so late 1800s. We also see makerspaces in libraries around this time too, in both the United States and Canada, offering crafting, sewing, quilting, things like that. So makerspaces are really not new. But let's talk a little bit about why the trend has really made this recent reemergence. And we really see a number of factors kind of coming together here at the same time. Make magazine, which is largely considered to be kind of the makerspace Bible, was first published in 2005 and continues to be published today. And coincidentally, or maybe not, that's the first year that Etsy was founded. MIT also began their Fab Lab program with the class How to Make Almost Anything in the early 2000s. With the economy crash in 2008, we definitely see in society this shift towards more budget-friendly, do-it-yourself solutions as people are kind of tightening their belts and their budgets around their work. And around the same time, technology makes this really significant evolutionary shift forward with touchscreen phones and tablets becoming much more commonplace. So in the world of education, this then leads us to this discussion about knowledge acquisition, the value of memorizing facts when information is so accessible through these tools. And this discussion, as you all know, went a number of different directions in the educational design world and has a lot of different implications. But one result was this renewed emphasis on things that iPads couldn't do for you, like invent a prototype and figure out how to construct it. We also see that libraries, which for a long time were repositories of printed material, really began to question their own identity and embraced makerspaces as a way to really engage the community's interest in making. So the movement in general is really well summarized in this book, Mark Hatch's Maker Manifesto. So Mark was the founder of one of the more popular and well-known makerspaces called Tech Shop. And these words on the screen are some of his action words for what people do in makerspaces and why it matters. So he talks about how making is really fundamental to being human, that learning is a part of the process, and that there's always more to learn about making. New techniques, new materials, new processes, and that now is really an interesting time for makerspaces because tools have never been cheaper, easier to use, or more powerful than they are today. He also talks about makerspaces as a way for the community to participate in making all together, either by holding seminars, parties, events, fairs for other makers, and how this really becomes an agent of change for the community. In the world of education, we see that this trend also really took off because it filled a particular gap that had been noticeable for some time. So we've seen in the past plenty of teaching methodology focused on visual and oral learners, and options for kinesthetic learners, for those who learn through more physical activity, were actually relatively few. So Makerspace has really become a way for them to engage in that opportunity. So when we look at some of the overall goals for modern education, these are some of the characteristics that we often hear from our clients that are important, and makerspaces in an educational setting can really be a strong practice arena for students to work on these skills. But what's even more interesting, we think, is to compare these to what employers are saying they want from employees in a modern work environment. And you can see here there's a lot of overlap in terms of what educators are looking to provide and what employers are looking for in their employees. And when we look at school and office design from 50 years ago or more, it's clear that education and workplace have been informing one another for a really long time. So, you know, the environment on the left is a great preparation for the environment on the right. Information delivered to rows of desks really coordinates with the style of workspaces that we saw many years ago. So when we fast forward to some of the designs that we see for these spaces today, we see that makerspaces can really support the mutual goals of both education and workplace environments, and that they can be found in both, and that both range in their approach from something much more dirty and industrial to something more abstract and focused on innovative thought. But because there is this range, we've really noted in our research some different examples that we'd like to use as thought starters to share with you. So I'm going to hand it back over to Allie, who's going to talk a little bit about our research.
All right, so this question, what do you mean by makerspace? And then we have an image of a 3D printer, which I think is what comes to mind for a lot of people. We've seen an increasing trend from school districts asking for makerspaces over the last several years. But we've found that when we dig a little bit deeper and trying to get more information on the type of program and curriculum that they want out of that space, we found that a lot of people were actually interested in the idea, but didn't really know beyond a 3D printer necessarily what they actually wanted out of it. So our group kind of took it upon ourselves to help define that. So makerspaces can take many shapes and forms, and so what we decided to do was compile our own makerspace projects first, evaluate them based on what we have seen and what we've designed, and then secondly, we took a number of benchmarking trips around the US as part of our research and benchmarking group, and saw where other people were having successes in different parts of the country, so that we could help guide our clients towards a design solution that would best fit. So this map is showing a few of the places that we targeted as kind of hubs with either a high concentration or highly advertised makerspaces that seem to be pretty popular. So we sent out some groups to visit these and tour these, and you can see a small list on the left of the places that we visited. You'll notice that a lot of them are, it's a mix of K-12, higher ed, public spaces, and then we tried to hit a few different regions as well, so we weren't getting kind of skewed regionalized data either. We know this is a lot of information, and we definitely don't expect you to be able to read it all, but we just wanted to show you kind of what we gathered at each location that we visited. So we asked questions on our tours as far as how the space was being used, the courses that were taught there, how the staff worked with the group, the types of equipment, the size of the space, the types of tools that they used, and then obviously took a lot of photos as well. And so that helped us to kind of boil it down based on after we took all these trips, we did all of our own benchmarking of our own projects and kind of created these 4 main categories that we would like to start to summarize some of the trends that we found and share some examples of each in the hopes that you will have a better way to differentiate makerspace expectations and needs as you design them.
All right, so the first example that we'd like to dive into is what we're calling a discovery lab. A discovery lab supports short-term or spontaneous projects. Oftentimes, these spaces may be lower tech than some of the examples that we will share with you later. They're very lively, vibrant, small-scale spaces that are really designed to excite the creativity of users just as soon as they enter the room. So you may see shelves and storage bins, housing supplies for crafting materials or artistic creations. In some cases, the contents of the makerspace might be housed on a cart even that travels from room to room if a permanent space isn't really available. So some places that we saw these types of makerspaces were most commonly in elementary schools, sometimes museums or libraries, and all of them offered lots of opportunities to display work that had been completed there. So we wanted to share just a few examples with you guys of each type. And these are a combination of Stantec projects and projects that we saw on our benchmarking tours, which if you remember were a combination of our projects and projects done by others. So for the projects that we worked on, we put our little Stantec logo down in the bottom corner, and for projects by others, we did not. So we just wanted to clarify that for you as we go through some of these spaces. So this first example Many of you may have heard of. This is Stanford's D School, which was one of the early pioneers of makerspace studios. And it's featured pretty prominently in the book Makerspace, which has been a conversation starter for a lot of people interested in makerspaces. And while the majority of the D School is much more technical than what you're seeing here, this particular space is subdivided to be a K-12 studio where groups of K-12 students are invited in to do workshops. The K-12 studio is really a thought starter space to inspire younger students or sometimes K-12 staff to really be creative and explore the value of making. They offer partnerships, lots of training modules. They also have this really interesting methodology whereby they would sort of retrofit and change the space by adding partitions to this post and beam system that they had in the building. This next example is from North Stafford High School, which recently undertook a pretty major upgrade to its entire library. And we took polls of students to really determine what features they found to be most useful in their current library, and then designed the renovated space to really emphasize or enlarge those areas. So the students told us in the surveys that they really came to the library for computer access, to socialize, to study research and ideas. And one of the concepts that came up was actually the makerspace. So this makerspace was formerly the traditional computer lab that we oftentimes see associated adjacent to libraries. And this makerspace really allows students to express ideas and concepts through a pretty broad choice of media, and is a place for them to engage in all the activities that they indicated in that survey was important to them. So computer and technology use, working with their fellow students in groups, researching and doing independent study. One thing that the staff mentioned was really helpful in this particular makerspace. You can see that underneath the counter, and for a lot of the storage solutions in this room, it's either open shelving or cabinets with kind of clear doors on them. And they emphasize that having the visibility to see the supplies and tools that were there really increased their use. So this school really found a lot of success in showcasing the materials that were available. And this shows some of the other supporting spaces from the library, which still does have a traditional book collection, and also has these smaller collaborative spaces for students to study alone. This is the Pew Library at Grand Valley State University, which really took a really innovative approach to the modern library. Book storage was consolidated into a very small portion of the library, and a machine is used to retrieve books. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. So this really freed up an enormous amount of space to devote to places for tutoring, places for students to meet, working on projects, and of course a small makerspace. So this makerspace is in our Discovery Lab style, and it's more like an open showroom kind of a setup. So the lab is open to all students, but it can be reserved at times for specific courses like computer engineering, marketing, video game design, VR, and product design. So the lab is run by trained students and one faculty member. Some of the equipment available for use includes a VR experience, a 360 camera, 2D and 3D printers, a Spherio 2.0 programming game and tool, and an Ozabot robot as well. This is just a quick snapshot of some of the other things that we saw in this style of makerspaces, just some and other styles of the Discovery Lab rather, which was just some really creative ways to allow students to kind of spontaneously interact with objects, like the Lego wall that you see there on the left that kind of offers all the parts and pieces you need to kind of spontaneously build. So some of the projects that we saw being created in these types were things like rubber band racers, straw rocket shooters, basic weather stations, spin art, some musical instruments. So a lot of different interesting projects there. We also saw in some cases that there would be, if there wasn't a dedicated space in the school for a makerspace, but they still wanted to offer that opportunity, they would include some kind of a mobile cart solution, like this Teacher Geek Maker Cart that we're showing here on the right. This is a way that you can kind of house all of those tools in a consolidated way and move it around from room to room instead of moving the students to a particular place in the building. Another example is Stratasys, which is really just a large bus, if you will, that houses a lot of different technology options. And it travels around the country to different locations, and it's kind of a way to just showcase different technology pieces that are available. And with that, let me turn it back to Ali to talk about our second type.
All right, so a fabrication lab is kind of a step up as far as the robust type of equipment that you'll find compared to a discovery lab. So its primary function is typically academic support at a secondary or higher education facility, although it might be open to students outside of class times and not necessarily associated with a course. But oftentimes it does support specific coursework, or it might be integrated. We've seen a lot of times as part of a career and technology program or a vocational building, kind of as support for those spaces. And oftentimes these will have dedicated staff, which is a little bit different than the Discovery Lab sometimes. And it might also partner, especially at the higher ed level, with a local business for additional support and kind of that community connection, which is always helpful. The equipment is generally a little bit more advanced. Sometimes it will require training, usually designed to support semester-long projects. So project storage becomes actually a really key component for these types of maker spaces. Some examples of equipment that you'd find might include a 3D printer, a laser cutter, CNC router, sewing station. We've even seen vinyl cutters, jewelry, ceramics, paint booths, and vacuum molding as a few examples. So this example is from Manor New Tech Middle School, and as the name kind of implies for a fab lab, gets more into building with equipment. So knowing the type of equipment will help shape what you need to, how you need to design your fabrication lab. So some equipment will actually warrant its own room for exhaust or to isolate noise. So you can see that in this view on the left. There's a door, a storefront door with some windows that houses its own equipment. These are often located in middle schools and high schools and public access as well. And they all, depending on the type, they all kind of have unique scheduling and space needs as well. Fab Lab tasks can range from small scale industrial type design, like for instance, a fidget spinner, to more large scale robotics competition type things or solar powered cars. So since Fab Labs can kind of support a wide range of projects and sizes, the availability of power is really key, as well as storage. So you can see in this picture, we have some overhead power reels that come down from the ceiling, which is a great solution for accessibility, especially when you're working with either an existing building where you can't add floor cores or you don't have as much power as you might like. Additionally, outdoor access for a Fab Lab is really critical. So you can see there's an overhead garage door that goes to the outside, and actually one in the foreground that goes to a big 3-story space on the inside. So they can easily transport projects around Also, a big benefit to having an adjacent classroom in the Fab Lab for when group training is required or if a team wants to present a project, as well as separate storage areas for bigger items like metal and wood, which also helps to control access, especially in a K-12 setting. So this is one example from one of our tours that was at UNC Hill Library. So about 25% of the time at this one, it's used by students in conjunction with a course, but the other 75% of the time, it's students or staff who are actually using it just kind of on their own, individually. So anyone with a UNC ID can actually use this space, but they are required to first take a safety course, and it's kind of come and go, no appointments necessary, except I believe they schedule the laser cutter in particular, just because that's a little higher demand. And they have one staff member that is employed by the library and runs the space, which is funded by student fees. Some other photos from the UNC Hill Library. There's a display case you can see in the photo on the left, which features student work, and since it's associated adjacent to the library, it's kind of a way for them to advertise, which is nice for students passing by. Equipment includes laptops, 3D printers, sewing machines, soldering equipment, 3D scanners, laser, and vinyl cutters. You can also see some exhaust arms are required because of soldering, which is also recommended for 3D printers. They also employed the overhead power and pegboards and cabinets for supply storage and project storage. Next, we have the Bray Lab at Tufts University. This one, actually at Tufts University, they have several makerspaces. This is just one example that was part of their Department of Mechanical Engineering, which is one large shop and a few lighter labs. It was originally a resource for several classes, including mechanical, civil, biomed engineering, and design, but they have since opened it up as a resource for the whole campus, and it's funded by alumni donations and department funding. Also on Tufts University, this is a little bit in contrast to the previous one. This is the CRISP Signal Processing, Robotics, and Structures Lab, which was a large flexible space really only used by the Human-Centered Engineering group and used as part of their curriculum, so rather than kind of that come-and-go model of the previous one. So they had a workspace with a multitude of storage options and places to plug in. And then we wanted to look at the K-12 level. This is Plano STEAM in Plano, Texas. So it actually was a renovation to a 3-story call center that actually sat abandoned for several years before it was converted into this STEAM academy for high school students. The majority was kept open, so it kind of pays homage back to its call center days, but furniture was used to creatively divide up the space as needed, and only rooms that needed to be enclosed were actually enclosed, so it was very flexible. Their curriculum at Plano STEAM was project-based learning, so the school uses their fabrication lab to support several of their projects that the students have going on, and it includes a welding booth, a laser cutter, a sawmill, among a lot of other equipment. And they have a strong partnership with Texas Instruments, which also has a campus in Plano. And additionally, it helps support their robotics club. So some other examples on our tours that we saw that we thought were just kind of some interesting design features, little details. So the one on the left is how to reset the space that we saw at a Stanford tour, which is kind of nice when you have a lot of different groups using the same space to keep it organized, making sure that it's not left in disarray for the next group, and just to kind of maintain some order. The middle image is from Columbia College, which was my favorite example of tool organization. So they had kind of this checkout counter, and somebody who worked behind the counter. You could see all the images of the tools that they had available to rent. So somebody that was staffed was actually responsible for organizing it. So it wasn't just kind of a take what you need and put it back situation, which kept them very organized. And then we also saw just the third image, just lots of marker surface, chalkboard surface, just ways to keep the ideas flowing, which is always nice for makerspaces as well. Now back to Gwen for type 3.
If I remember to unmute myself, that would help. Thank you, Allie. Our third type that we found we're calling more of an industrial or a manufacturing solution. So some of the makerspaces that we saw are designed for much more robust industrial projects. So oftentimes these were housed by larger scale companies for the purposes of prototyping or product developing. But I think what makes it relevant to this conversation is that they oftentimes partner with the community and offer hours for outside parties to come in and make use of their space. That said, the equipment in some of these spaces is often quite large, very specific, very expensive, and sometimes requires really specific training or safety protection while operating the machinery. So one example that we saw is M-Hub, which is in Chicago. And this is a 63,000 square foot converted Motorola factory that offers space for, quote, inventors, makers, and risk takers in Chicago. So this space was focused on physical product development and manufacturing, and it was really begun as a response to Chicago kind of falling behind on patents per capita in their city. So the center offers monthly memberships, and it's been used for projects like pancreas pumps, just as one example. So there are some garages that are used for lab space, as well as rooms with butcher block tables for additional workspace. There's machines for plastic bending, sandblasting, injection molding, things of that nature. We were also really fortunate to tour not one but two of Autodesk's makerspaces, one in San Francisco and one in Boston. The one in San Francisco, located at Pier 9, is really a center for design and digital manufacturing. So community partners can use this space as well. It's really designed to push the boundaries of design and digital manufacturing, and people from all over Autodesk, as well as the community, come here to kind of explore and learn more. And they even have, across the street from this facility, they have a museum space that showcases kind of all the things that Autodesk or people using their space have helped to innovate and create. So equipment training is required here. People come from different disciplines and different industries to explore what they can make in their own space. They also have a summer internship program where anyone can apply and be accepted. And they shared with us that the oldest intern they ever had was 85 years old who joined them to learn about making. I thought that the solution you see here on the screen was really interesting. They have these large bays with garage doors for exterior access. And you can see they've got these taller, clear divider panels. And what's great about that is they can use those to kind of subdivide the space as needed, depending on who is using the space for a project at any given time. So within this space, you could have, 4 smaller teams working on smaller projects, or you could open up those partitions to form kind of one larger connected space if you had something much bigger going on. One thing that was critical, especially in these more industrial spaces, is the idea of dividing quiet and loud spaces from each other, especially when you've got these really robust machines that can be quite noisy. So oftentimes we would see these sort of separated labs, either for kind of smaller workspace or sometimes computer labs if the computers had specific design programs loaded on them that would complement the machines that were next door. And acoustic separation was pretty critical in those spaces. We oftentimes would see separate storage rooms here for supplies, depending on how the space is used. A lot of times in these spaces, the people using the space were required to provide their own materials, as opposed to some of the previous types where the materials were often just stocked and on hand and available. And of course that has to do with the specialization of these types of spaces. It would be almost impossible to predict all the materials that could be needed for projects taking place in these spaces. We also saw that some of these facilities would offer office space for local businesses to hold mentoring office hours for students who were using the space or community members who were experimenting. And so the office space could also be rented by startup companies if they were trying to get a product off the ground using this space. One other example in this category that's a little bit different, but we thought was really interesting. In 2013, the UT Medical Branch in Galveston started a Maker Nurse program after noticing that nurses were really very innovative in their approach to problem solving. And one of the more famous examples of this is that the IV guard, which you see there on the right, was developed after someone noticed that nurses were using plastic cups to hold IVs in place back in the day. So this Maker Nurse program, just one example of a project that came out of that on the left-hand side here. This is a solution for burn bath victims that this particular nurse kind of hacked together, if you will. So previously, burn victims, there's a requirement that water would be run over the burn continuously to kind of clean out the damaged area. And previously, burn victims would be kind of propped up in this larger shower and periodically repositioned so that the stream of water could hit all the key areas, kind of depending on the severity and the extent of the burn. But this nurse rigged up a system that allowed patients to lay down a little bit more comfortably, and the PVC pipe with the adjustable nozzles here really allows the water distribution to be customized to suit that person rather than repositioning the person under that unmovable shower head. So just one interesting example of a project that came out of that type of makerspace.
All right, so our last type here is maybe a little bit different than the previous three and less expected, but it is often labeled as a makerspace, so we thought it was really important to include to kind of help guide conversations and expectations. So that is a co-working and incubator space. You might not see a product that you can actually touch and feel here like you did in the previous three. Co-working spaces, as I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, are more like a makerspace of ideas where people can come together in an environment, foster collaboration, creativity, and innovation. So they can either house really small startup companies that are only a couple people, or even just a touchdown space for a single person working remotely. So we kind of, as designers, need to think about what kind of space encourages the making of ideas. The term incubator space as well is sometimes referred to as a makerspace, but more focused on the ideation stage of the design process, where it might be taken to a makerspace, more like the previous three that we described after the ideation phase. So this type is less common in K-12 and more common in higher ed and public spaces. And similar to an industrial makerspace that Gwen was just describing, there could be office hours or rentable office space, which would need to be considered as part of that design as well. So one of the spaces that we toured that falls into this category is actually in the Merchandise Mart. And NeoCon isn't happening this year, but if you are able to make it next year, we would suggest checking this one out. It's an interesting co-working space kind of tucked in all of the showroom areas. So it offers a multitude of different settings and furniture arrangements, so each person can choose the setting that best works for them. They had options like treadmill desks and bean bags and small huddle rooms, phone booths, so different areas for smaller meetings that are more private. Also, we found with these types, you almost always see them paired with a coffee shop or a restaurant, cafe kind of some sort, which this one in the Merchandise Mart had as well. Similarly, this is one that our team toured in California called the Hannah House, which was originally the Varsity Theater, which was built in the 1920s and was kind of that central hub for community and conversation for about 50 years before it was converted into a bookstore. And then it was vacant for several years before the Hannah House came in and revitalized this landmark building to be a cafe and workspace to kind of attract the innovators in the area. So they had a few workspace options to choose from. They had open seating, lounge seating in conference rooms that were all bookable by the hour to give you the freedom and flexibility to reserve the space how you needed it. And they also did include a coffee shop and an event space. Similar to the Hannah House, as I'm sure we're all familiar with WeWork, where their core mission is to create a collaborative community where entrepreneurs and small businesses can interact and exchange ideas. So to support this goal, the design had a lot of glass front offices, benching, desking, community areas, including soft seating, conference rooms. They had lounges, game areas, coffee bars, pantries, and even beer carts on site. This example is a little different than the previous two, but it still supports that incubator model. So the Trinity Groves Restaurant Incubator in Dallas, it fosters growth of concepts and startups and encourages chefs to kind of create and present concepts to experienced restaurant owners who can then support them. So it kind of serves as like a launch pad for people with ideas for new restaurants to get a start and then support that collaborative community model of a co-working and incubator culture. Now we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive and I'll pass it over to Gwen.
So the types of makerspaces that we just shared with you, these 4 types, kind of summarize kind of 4 different directions that you could take with a makerspace that we saw during the benchmarking trips that we took. And what we'd now like to share briefly with you is something hot off the press that demonstrates kind of the current status of maker culture. And then we'll conclude by sharing some predictions about makerspaces of the future. Highland Park ISD is a small district in Dallas, Texas. The community is fairly small and contains a number of successful businessmen and women, and students here are generally pretty high achieving. They perform quite well on standardized tests. The 4-year graduation rate is over 99%. And this is their high school building, which is housed in this really beautiful 1920s building that's been added on to many times over the years. So you might think that, you know, this school is successful and therefore there's really no need for innovation. But the leadership disagreed and wanted to have a way for students not just to make good grades and kind of check off those boxes, but to really be engaged in their educational experience. So they applied for and were awarded a grant through the Moody Innovation Institute for STEAM and STEM spaces. So specifically, after doing a poll of the student population to kind of see what kind of programs they would be interested in, they selected 2 new programs for the school, engineering design and business entrepreneurialism, both of which were to be supported by a makerspace. What we knew as the design team going in right off is that this was going to be a very different type of makerspace from what we had looked at previously, in that it was supporting much more professional, kind of business-driven programs. So in some ways, it was kind of a combination of the co-working or incubator space that Ali just shared, but also about tangible items, robotics, and so on. So in that sense, it was a little bit more like a fabrication lab. But on top of these layers of functionality, it really needed to have this very professional, business-like aesthetic to blend in with the community's expectations. In the most recent addition to the building, I mentioned there have been several over the years, the district had shelled out the third floor of that particular addition, as it wasn't quite needed yet, but it was anticipated as being needed for the future. And so the MAPS program, as this came to be called, the Moody Advanced Professional Studies program, moved into part of that shelled space. So the plan includes, see if I can get a pointer to work here. Looks like not today. Over on the right-hand side, there's two larger classroom spaces, one for each program, and they both open onto this large centralized makerspace, which is the big open space you see there in the middle. And so supporting these really key program components, we also have a couple of offices up at the top of the plan there. And then near the bottom, we have a conference room that is for presentations to the business community, as well as a small breakout space. And there's room over on the left-hand side of the plan for future growth if they end up adding additional programs beyond the two that they are initially piloting. So when you reach the third floor of this building, this is kind of your first glimpse into the MAPS program. One thing that was really key to the design was the desire for this space to stand out from the rest of the school, which, if you recall from the image of the front of the building, was a very traditional building with quite a rich history. So here there was a deliberate effort to take a separate approach to branding that was very intentional. So environmental graphics were really key in expressing that something special was happening in this part of the building. So we have a wall here that kind of announces the name of the program when you first come in, but we also wanted to make it functional, offering places to sit, a screen for collaboration, a tackable surface, and so on. Moving a little further in, we reached the breakout collaboration space, which is meant to imitate more of a modern workplace environment with furniture that's really enabling those casual interactions after hours. And then the space opens up to the makerspace, which you see here. The walls with blue glass in the back are those two classrooms I mentioned that have that immediate adjacency to the makerspace. And the makerspace itself has tables of various heights. It has mobile storage pieces, as well as a few pieces of fixed millwork. And these really offer some additional storage and also home for some of the equipment that's more permanently available, and power access for that equipment. We also have a sink in the space just off to the left. Here's a quick peek inside the classrooms, which have very flexible furniture and quite a bit of built-in storage for supplies and materials. And this is the professional conference room where students can meet together or make presentations to business community members who are an active part of the educational program. So this facility has been open since October, but students have already engaged in a number of different design to fabrication experiences with creative technologies like building remotely operated cars and robots. They also have really invited the business community in to participate in their program. So this photo is showing that same makerspace that we shared earlier, but you can see that it's actually flexible enough to be completely repurposed to be used as kind of a tiered lecture space for presentations or guest speakers. And that's actually achieved primarily through just different seating heights that are available in the space when you move out those tables. So this project is our most current example of makerspaces today, and we'd like to conclude by just taking a quick peek into the future about what we might expect down the road from makerspaces.
All right, so what's next? So as with many things, it often helps to zoom out and kind of look at the bigger picture and see where things are going. So aside of where they are today, kind of what are the next generation's experiences going to be in making? I think the biggest question is really what new space types will today's students demand of their workplace? So how can we kind of help shape that? So we need to figure out where they're going. We need to examine the forces on our culture and our society that drive change to figure out how makerspaces might adapt. So our group kind of identified a cycle similar to the age-old chicken and egg concept, where both innovation and space design can begin this change cycle. So we would prefer that innovation drives so that we can properly design spaces. And to give you an example of innovation as the driver, we can use the Trinity Grove's restaurant concept that we described earlier, where there was the innovative idea of giving a restaurant startup more support, which then led to resource needs, which then ultimately a space was needed for chefs to test and present their concepts and serve their patrons, which then led to behavioral change of the patrons who seek out fresh and new restaurant concepts at that location, as well as more accessibility and support for new chefs, and they kind of know where to go for that. In an educational setting, sometimes a makerspace will be a part of the program, but without necessarily a curriculum that feeds into one. So that's an example of space type as the instigator of the cycle. So that leads to behavioral change because the students and teachers will start to integrate the usage of that space into their projects, which will hopefully then spur on innovation and expand their desires for what they need. They'll kind of figure out what they like and what they want, which will hopefully then be able to create more maker resources for the community. So as designers, we need to stay ahead of the progression of what makerspaces might become so that we can shape our spaces accordingly. So we want to leave you with some final thought-provoking questions to think about just the future of makerspaces and where it's going. So the first is the potential for an emergence of new space types. So how will 21st century students shape demands on the workplace? Are we going to start seeing virtual reality rooms more common as VR has really taken off? There's products like the Oculus Medium where you can use handheld controllers to virtually make products. So are we going to need to create spaces that support that type of software more? So maybe it's an immersive environment that allows a small group to participate in making together and present ideas to each other rather than a single person on a headset, just to create a little bit more inclusion. We've also seen a wave of innovation from startups and a need to support them. And startups need resources really that relieve the financial burden early on. So we think we might see an increase in more public shared makerspaces or even facilities opening up to the public that maybe previously weren't. So like K-12 or higher ed. So also we kind of live in this accelerated culture of sharing with companies like Uber and Airbnb and Instacart, which I think a lot of us have probably used or are familiar with. So sharing makerspace resources will likely become more embraced and accessible as well. And kind of with these blurred lines of live, work, and play, we need to think about how we need to change spaces to kind of decentralize and support people who either work in those industries or who use those industries and kind of like that model. We also think we'll see an increase in entrepreneurship due to how accessible they've become. So there are forums like Etsy and eBay where people can turn their creations into cash. So we have also thought about the fact that we might see more physical maker spaces that will start to attach more on-site retail spaces in the future to help support local makers rather than having it all just online. And finally, we wanted to address the effect that our current pandemic might have on maker spaces. So if we do see an increase in the remote workforce, as some are predicting, will we see a rise in more mobile makerspace options, like the Discovery Lab van example that Gwen mentioned earlier? And as we transition back out of this and back into our normal environments. Will makerspaces be open but with reduced occupancy rules or extended hours? Potentially they'll adapt to allow digital transfer of designs to a makerspace, and there will be perhaps a person on site who can actually do the running of the machinery, and then maybe it'll be kind of a curbside or drive-through pickup of your prototype rather than you being there and physically running the equipment yourself. So these are all things that we think as designers we need to stay ahead of and be prepared for as our clients are kind of adapting in this changing world. So we hope that this has been helpful and that we've been able to put into perspective the various types of makerspaces as well as where they originated and the ways we anticipate them adapting to our changing culture. So I think now we're ready to address any questions.
It looks like we had a couple of questions and comments trickle in while we were talking, so we'll start there, and if you guys want to type any more in while we're wrapping up, that would be great. We have a comment here or a question around when we were speaking earlier about the history of makerspaces. Someone pointed out that there was also a very influential maker fair in San Francisco in 2006. Which, yes, great reminder, was also a really important part of setting this trend. So a lot of things were kind of coming together around that same period of time, and that's an important one to mention also. Let's see here. We had a question about acoustical separation for makerspaces and whether or not that influenced the placement of the makerspace within the school, or if there were special treatments for consideration. And I think we definitely saw some of that in our benchmarking. Definitely for those more industrial manufacturing spaces, those absolutely required pretty intense acoustical separation because the machines are so large and so loud. I think within a more typical K-12 environment, we often would see these spaces grouped down by your dining room or your gymnasium, sometimes a little bit closer to other programs that also have a little bit of noise associated with them. But in other cases, if we're looking at more of a discovery lab type, like you might see in an elementary school, it would be more common to see something kind of like a converted art space that might not necessarily need the acoustic separation just because the equipment isn't very robust or very loud. So definitely always a consideration, but treated in different ways depending on the application. Let me scroll down here. There is a comment here around makerspaces and libraries and integrating those into library spaces versus the space being used for books. And the project referenced in this question is the Pew Library, which I think is probably the most extreme example that we saw. That was a new building where they chose to actually put all of the books into a consolidated space and have them retrieved by robots so that the rest of the space could be used for something else, including, among other things, a small makerspace. I would say that's probably a little bit more rare compared to what we would typically see. But there are some people that are interested in that kind of total replacement of the book. I think what was a lot more common was to keep a lot of those physical resources there and repurpose areas like the traditional computer lab, which a lot of people have found to be not quite as effective as it maybe was in the past. So we saw a wide range of responses from clients and from the makerspaces that we toured. But I would say that the Pew Library example was kind of on the extreme end of concealing all of the books. Scroll down here a little bit further, or Allie, jump in if you see one.
Sure. Yeah, so it looks like the next one is, have we heard of a school system considering creating a mobile makerspace classroom that could travel to different schools and be designed to be attached for a period of time. The advantage is accessibility, security can be designed in, but it requires us having measure in place for the design of the prototype. That's a really good point. I don't know that I've personally seen a K-12 school that had a mobile makerspace that could attach to the facility. I don't know if you have, Gwen.
I haven't either. We shared that Stratasys example of the bus that kind of travels around. That was not tied to a school district, though. And of course, we saw those little maker carts that go from classroom to classroom within a school, but not something that travels between buildings. So that's a really interesting idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might be something we see more of in the future. So it looks like the next one is, in a school, how much space would you provide for student project storage that takes multiple weeks? Is this near the makerspace or at their general classroom? I'd say it depends on the level of schooling first. So if it's an elementary school, sometimes it will be more like a discovery lab where it might just be a part of their kind of home classroom. But if it is a middle school or high school level or higher ed, a lot of times that will be a dedicated, the storage will be dedicated in that makerspace or in an adjacent room that connects to the makerspace. And it kind of depends on the types of scale of projects. You know, a high school might be doing a lot more robust kind of like robotics and construction type projects that will require storage of 2x4s and sheet metal. Whereas as the lower grade levels, it might just be more things like pipe cleaners and cotton balls that can just be kind of housed in just traditional casework or cubbies with bins. So that's kind of, I'd say, get a lot of information from the client, I guess would be my thought on that one.
It looks like we have a question here about whether in elementary schools, if we've seen makerspaces more commonly associated with the library or with the art room. I think I personally have seen both. I would say probably more commonly in the library, but certainly we have a couple of examples where the art room was really more of that space. Allie, have you seen more of one than the other?
Yeah, I think the library. Yeah, I think the library area tends to be more of that that community commons hub that oftentimes it kind of makes sense as a shared resource, where the art room tends to be a little bit more scheduled potentially.
Looks like our last question is about whether we've conducted post-occupancy surveys related to makerspaces and whether we're tying them to being successfully supported by experienced support staff, material resupply, so kind of some of the logistics in addition to those design components. And our research and benchmarking team has not done post-occupancy surveys on that particular topic, but that would certainly be interesting to see. When we did our benchmarking, we did have a list of very specific questions that we asked folks about makerspaces that had been in operation for quite some time. So in that sense, it's somewhat of a post-occupancy survey, but we shared some of that with you today. We have not done a formal kind of distributed by email survey, no.
And then it looks like we just got one more question in the floor surfaces that best hold up. Oftentimes I've seen the most success with polished concrete or even sealed concrete just because of all of the heavy equipment and students especially with materials and building. Would you agree, Gwen?
I would say concrete is probably what I've seen most often as well. Definitely a hard surface flooring that's easy to clean.
Yes. Well, if that was all the questions, we finally just wanted to plug our upcoming webinars with our colleagues who will be hosting these webinars in partnership with A4LE, so we hope that you can join these as well. And we just thank you for your time today. If we don't, oh, looks like we had a couple more questions pop up. How long did the benchmarking process take, and how was it funded? That's a good question. Gwen, do you want to actually take that one?
Sure. Yeah. I would say that the time that we left for the actual tours themselves took place over about a year. Obviously, there was some planning on the front end and some assembly of information on the back end, but we gave ourselves about that much time to do the traveling and the tours. And it was funded by Stantec. We feel that this research and benchmarking program really helps us find kind of the best practices and the brightest ideas that helps make our projects better. So we are willing to financially support that. And then there's a last question here about ceiling types that are most common. And I would say in most of the ones that I have seen, with the exception of kind of the co-working spaces, I think we've oftentimes left the ceilings exposed, actually. It offers a lot of flexibility for the future. It helps with, you know, bringing cord reels down so that you have flexible power and connections. So I'd say most commonly there's actually no ceiling. All right, I think that was the last question. So thank you again for attending today. It was good to have this discussion with you all, and great questions. Thank you.
Okay. So that's going to conclude our session. I want to thank Gwen and Allison for sharing their expertise with us today, and all of our registrants for attending today's program. Your certificate of attendance and evaluation form will be emailed to you within the next 24 hours, and we ask that you take a moment to provide us with your thoughts on today's program. You can get registered for all of our upcoming live webinars as well as on-demand recordings of previous programs at education.a4le.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful